If Americans perceive the US as a singular nation, does it influence how they perceive Europe? Nah. I'm quite aware that they differ from one country to another. Significant cultural differences and all that. Average Americans do not think about Europe that much. People don't perceive the US as a singular nation. It is a singular nation. Europe isn't a country, but a continent with many countries. And most Americans generally, unless it is relevant to their income, don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about your POI in general. Unless it's to fantasize about universal healthcare and functional public transportation. It's the same way how people lump all Asian and African countries together. Europeans do the same thing too. No, the two aren't comparable. The US is a country. Europe is a continent. Americans knows that Mexico, Canada, and the US are different places, so it leads to reason that they know France, Italy, Germany, etc. are different places too. It's not seeing Europeans as all the same, but there are cultural similarities across Europe and they're geographically close to each other. Other than Canada and Australia, Europe is kind of a catch-all location for all the countries Americans consider its peer countries. For me at least, and I assume for a lot of other people, it simply comes down to the structure of the US itself. It makes a lot more sense to compare the US to the EU in terms of things like geographic size, cultural diversity, GDP, military strength, biodiversity, emissions, population, ecosystems, etc. than it does to compare the US to Estonia or Latvia. I don't think of the EU as a homogeneous culture, and I'm well aware of the fact that the diversity of cultures, laws, and especially languages is greater than the US. But to compare the US to any one EU country is to do a major disservice to how vast and varied the US is. Rural versus urban aside, the personal experiences of someone growing up in rural Utah are going to be so different in terms of climate, culture, laws, and even language than someone growing up in South Florida that you can't really make an accurate comparison among smaller EU countries. Caveat: I usually make the comparison of the EU, and I think that most people probably mean to. But which countries Americans will actually include in their idea of Western Europe will vary. No, I realize there's a difference from Britain and East Britain. With similar cultural background, I wouldn't say Europe has this. I think most Americans correctly view Europe as many different countries, but I have noticed that many people wrongfully assume that European culture is all very similar throughout the countries. Even if they do, it's not the same thing. The U.S. is actually one country with one actual main gov, where Europe is a whole lot of different countries that came together under one government. The US is a singular nation. Homie, I don't know which geography class you took. We might joke that it's 50 or so different war tribes dressed up in a trenchcoat with a military budget we could kill God with, but it's definitely one country. Unless you're talking about Mexico, US, and Canada, and we don't see those countries as part of us. Unless they wanted to be the United States of North America, would be kinda nuts. A little bit. There are some assumed European commonalities. Plus there is the EU and Schengen, even though it is not like the US federal system. But people are apt to say, "How European," about some things. People also recognize the differences and also say, "How Italian," or "How French," and so on. Recognize the major differences from WW2, the division between East and West, which Americans likely think is more dramatic than it really is. Also, As a land of immigrants, Americans often trace heritage to individual countries. I'm half Italian, 1/4 German, 1/4 Irish. It's simplifying. I see Europeans as different people, but I do not see them as similar to us. I just see them as any other foreigner. Europe, I feel, is pretty well defined as different countries. That said, I've heard the country of Africa more times than I'd like to admit. Cannot speak for most Americans. I know all the different countries of Europe, though in fairness, my degree was in European history, and I come from a family of historians and foreign affairs scholars. Most folks are told about the EU and have no idea how comprehensively it does or does not infringe on the sovereignty of the individual states within the EU. I'll tell you how Americans perceive Europe. There is a scene in the movie Lucy, where Scarlett calls the cops of something and tells them, 3 people about to arrive in Europe. I need you to arrest them. Not Europe, but maybe the EU could be something of a comparison someday. The countries that make up the EU may one day form a singular nation. In short, yes. Unless you pointed out they typically view Europe as a whole. When it comes up that I was born in Europe, people in the US will sometimes ask me which country. And if I say Amsterdam, that's a good answer. One time when I said, Holland, the person responded, "Ah, so you must speak Spanish." No? Turned out they thought Holland was in South America. So back to just saying Amsterdam. In recent years, more and more people know the name of the country is really the Netherlands, and enjoy telling me they know this.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. TooAfraidToAsk is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.